Order. Urgent question. Sarah Tether.
Ask the Secretary of State for International Development if she will make a statement on the current situation in Nigeria.
Minister of State, Mr. Hugo Swire.
Mr. Speaker, the Boko Haram terrorist group continues to wreak havoc across northeast Nigeria. Many colleagues will have seen the press reports over the last week highlighting their latest sickening attacks. Hundreds of people are believed to have been killed in the town of Baga in Borno State last week as Boko Haram continued their bloody insurgency campaign. Suicide bombings in urban areas are also a common feature of Boko Haram's tactics. This weekend, we saw another heinous example in the Yobe state town of Potiskum. These attacks, Mr. Speaker, are just the latest example of the insurgents' reign of terror. We believe that more than 4,000 people were killed by the group last year in northeast Nigeria. The United Nations estimates that over 1.5 million people have been displaced by terrorist activities and at least 3 million have been affected by the insurgency. The abductions of the Chibok schoolgirls of the 14th of April last year shocked the world and highlighted the mindless cruelty of Boko Haram. The group deliberately targets the weak and vulnerable, causing suffering in communities of different faiths and ethnicities. It is almost certainly the case that attacks by Boko Haram have killed more Muslims than Christians. 2015 is an important year for Nigeria's future. Presidential and state elections will take place in February. It is crucial that these are free, fair and credible, and that all Nigerians are able to exercise their vote without fear and intimidation. As Minister for the Commonwealth, I responded to the Right Honourable Member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, the former Prime Minister, on behalf of the Government in the last debate in this House on this subject. I am grateful to the Honourable Member for Brent Central for asking this timely question that will allow members from across the House to give this important issue the attention it surely deserves.
Sarah Tether.
This weekend saw an inspiring and moving display of international solidarity in the wake of the Paris shootings. But while we were watching the horror unfold in Paris, hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians were slaughtered by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria with very little international attention. While millions poured out onto the streets in Europe in a hopeful, defiant march for peace, thousands of Nigerians fled across the border into Chad in fear of further violence, adding to the tens of thousands who have already fled to Chad, Cameroon and Niger, and the million or so people displaced internally. I visited northern Nigeria with VSO in 2008, as recorded on my register of interest, to see projects working to improve access to and quality of primary education. Can the Minister tell the House how the UK government-funded programmes for education in northern Nigeria are responding to the escalating security situation and to the mass displacement of people? Can he also tell me what the Government is doing to ensure a rapid humanitarian response for refugees, mostly fleeing into countries that are already resource-poor and insecure? Looking ahead to the World Humanitarian Summit next year, are there lessons that can already be put into place around coordination of aid and support for local NGOs? Does he recognise that international NGOs are already hugely overstretched in this region, responding to multiple conflicts and Ebola? What is the Government doing to bring pressure to bear on the Nigerian Government to tackle Boko Haram and to prioritise protection to humanitarian workers? And can he tell the House what we are doing to encourage the Nigerian Government to stamp out corruption, which is such a breeding ground for loss of confidence in the state? And lastly, looking ahead to the Nigerian elections, how is he going to ensure that we can capitalise diplomatically on the window of opportunity provided by a newly elected Nigerian government to tackle these issues, however discredited their elections may turn out to be, when we ourselves will be in the middle of our own election campaign?
Minister of State.
I take this opportunity to thank the Honourable Lady again for this debate, which gives us the time to return to these matters. There is a problem in the world that when something else crops up elsewhere, we get easily diverted and forget the appalling suffering that continues in other parts of the world. And I pay tribute to all those world leaders who gathered actually in Paris at the weekend, including my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and the Je suis Charlie campaign, and I know all of us would have liked to have been there to show our solidarity with that too. But returning to the particular issue of Nigeria, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of managing the humanitarian crisis, we are working closely with our international partners to react to the large numbers of people who have now been displaced by the conflict in the north-east. It's an issue which affects not just Nigeria but also its close neighbours. The United Kingdom's contribution to the UN Central Emergency Response Fund and the European Commission's Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department programmes in 2014 is £1.7 million. Of course, that's the total budget from the DFID to Nigeria is one of the biggest in the world, something like £250 million, and that includes funding as well, of course, for the Safe Schools initiative and promoting women and girls' rights in northern Nigeria. British aid will help 800,000 more children go to school in Nigeria as a result of this funding, including 600,000 girls. The issue of corruption is one worth highlighting, Mr. Speaker. It's worth remembering when we discuss these matters that Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa. It spends 20% of its national budget on security. So, properly run, Nigeria should be able to do a lot of this work itself. But our money from DFID isn't just to alleviate poverty, although there is a huge disparate economy between the north and the south, but also to help build some robust institutions so that Nigeria can take on some of these problems themselves. She refers to the forthcoming election in February. We do have our concerns about this election, about possible violence during these elections, and actually also about the feasibility of running a nationwide election when an area the size of Belgium is now under Boko Haram.
Sir John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the member for Brent East for asking this question and you, Mr. Speaker, for granting it. The whole House will be shocked and outraged by reports that up to 2,000 people were killed in northern Nigeria last week, following a series of deadly and brutal attacks carried out by Boko Haram extremists. And most recently, we've heard reports of 23 people being killed in a bomb attack involving 3 young girls, one of whom is reported to have been just 10 years old. Eyewitness reports suggest that after one such murderous attack, hundreds of their victims' bodies were left strewn across the town of Baga, including children, women and the elderly. As the Minister highlighted, this follows months of violence across northern Nigeria, with killings, mass abductions and attacks against innocent civilians. These attacks and this brutality have been rightly condemned around the world, and whilst many people have rightly praised the moving solidarity this weekend across Europe, there can be no doubt about the need for solidarity also across continents in the wake of these appalling attacks, including, can I mention, the atrocity in the school in Peshawar, and can we welcome its reopening today, striking a blow against terrorism everywhere. So the world must not simply stand back and tolerate Boko Haram's brutal campaign of violence. Here in the UK, there is cross-party support for Britain to continue to provide support, alongside our allies, to the Nigerian authorities in their efforts to tackle Boko Haram. So can I ask the Minister to update the House on the level of that support and confirm if there have been any additional requests for British advice and expertise from the Nigerian government? The Minister rightly reminded us of the appalling kidnappings in Chibok, which brought much-needed global attention to the security situation in northern Nigeria and the vulnerability of civilians, and in particular women and girls at the hands of Boko Haram. The recent testimonies collected by Human Rights Watch from victims who escaped or were released show the appalling extent of their violent and brutal conditions in the Boko Haram camps where women and girls are held. In October, the Nigerian authorities announced they'd agreed a ceasefire with Boko Haram, which was supposed to see the schoolgirls safely returned. But this agreement was shattered by the horrific news that the suicide bomber wearing a school uniform set off a backpack full of explosives in the middle of a school assembly. So can the Minister provide the House with an assessment of the current plight of the girls who have been kidnapped by Boko Haram, what discussions his department has held with the Nigerian authorities on working together to secure their release?
Minister of State.
Well, I stand alongside the Shadow Minister by welcoming the reopening of the school in Peshawar, and we should all stand together, Mr. Speaker, against violence and terrorism around the world, and by doing that we can face it down. The Shadow Minister asked particularly about UK support. I imagine he was referring to the package of support announced by my right honourable friend, who is in his place, former Foreign Secretary, on the 12th of June 2014. So since then we have enlarged our programme of capacity building support to the Nigerian Armed Forces to provide direct tactical training and advice to the Nigerian forces engaged in this fight against terrorism. With France and the United States, we are supporting regional intelligence sharing arrangements between Nigeria and neighbours. As I said to the Honourable Lady for Brent, a DFID US aid partnership will draw 1 million more school children into education by 2020, which includes increased support for girls' education in particular. This is in addition to the £1 million which we committed in May to the UN Safe Schools initiative, which I alluded to earlier. And DFID are providing advice and assistance to Nigeria for a more strategic approach to economic development in the north. The Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, referred to the brutality of Boko Haram. There is no other word that describes their action better. They are extraordinarily brutal to their own Muslim brothers as well as to Christians, indeed anyone else who seems to get in their way. And the tales of what they have left behind when they move into these areas are too ghastly to rehearse here this afternoon. They are one of the most brutal organisations known to man. The issue that caught the attention of this House, and indeed caught the attention of the world, was of course the abduction of the Chibok girls. We are supporting the Nigerian authorities in trying to establish the girls' location still through the provision of surveillance assets and intelligence expertise. Information generated by these assets has been provided to an intelligence fusion cell in Abuja, where British personnel are working alongside Nigerian, American and French colleagues. We're clearly unable to comment on the results of ongoing intelligence operations, as the House will accept. But may I just say that whilst the girls are still missing, our resolve and the resolve of the international community to continue the search remains strong. But I would remind the House that we are dealing in an area under their control the size of Belgium, and intelligence is difficult, but we are not giving up at this point.
Sir Tony Baldry.
What is happening in northern Nigeria with Boko Haram is grotesque, and I think it's very important that the House and everyone should demonstrate that all human life is equally valid and equally sacred. But my right honourable friend made clear he is the Minister also for relations with the Commonwealth, and as the honourable gentleman who speaks for the opposition made clear, this is not just about northern Nigeria, this also equally applies to North West Frontier Province in Pakistan. So what is the potential for the Commonwealth as an institution to show solidarity in ensuring that Commonwealth countries collectively act together to support those states, those Commonwealth members that are seeking to resist terrorism and fundamentalism?
Well, I think my right honourable friend raises an extremely good point. I am the Minister for the Commonwealth. I happen not to have responsibility directly for Nigeria, but I have been asking officials about this this afternoon. I think there is a role here for the Commonwealth, particularly in the case of Nigeria. I think there is more work that could be done locally through the African Union and organisations such as that. But the Nigerian government have to want other countries to actually come in and do that. But talking about a pan-Commonwealth approach to dealing with terrorism of this nature, from which few countries seem to be immune currently, is, I think, something worth looking at and something I shall be raising with the Secretary-General.
Mr David Winnick.
Demonstration in Paris and in other French cities yesterday were amongst the most impressive in my lifetime against murderous religious fascism. Is it not a fact that there is general concern that the authorities in Nigeria are simply inadequate in dealing with this terrible threat to lives, and that time and again, when the Nigerian president has been under a good deal of international pressure, and rightly so, his response has been such that one can only come to the conclusion that the commitment to fight the terrorism and the atrocities in that country is not as it should be?
I think no one living outside the areas affected in Nigeria should believe for 1 minute that they are immune from the possible terrorist activities of Boko Haram. As I said earlier, there is an election in February. Presumably, there are those who wish to campaign in this large chunk of the country in the north. This is a problem for Nigeria. Yes, we certainly wish that the institutions in Nigeria were stronger. But both, I think, the Nigerian government and the international community are absolutely certain that Boko Haram needs to be righted out and quickly before it does further damage both within the country and to its vulnerable neighbours.
Mr. John Redwood.
I agree entirely with what the Minister and Shadow Minister have said, and particularly with the government's decision not to intervene directly with military force in Nigeria. Could the Minister explain, though, why he thinks the West is right to try and use military force in Syria and Iraq in rather similar situation, but not in Nigeria?
Well, we have deployed assistance to Nigeria, and we will continue to do that, particularly on the intelligence side. I repeat again to my right honourable friend, Nigeria is one of the richest countries in Africa and spends 20% of its own budget on defence expenditure. It should, in the normal course of events, be able to handle these things themselves. But it can't, and that is why we are providing assistance to enable it to do so. I think any parallel between what is going on in Syria and what is going on in Iraq is not a useful comparison, if I might say so. This is something localised to Nigeria, and we want to spread it, to prevent it spreading across other parts of Africa.
Diane Abbott.
I draw the House's attention to the registered members' interest, where I have registered visits to Nigeria over the years. The Minister will be aware that the situation in Nigeria is something of great concern to the British people. It's also of concern to the tens of thousands of our constituents with strong family connections in Nigeria who want to know what the British government is doing for their friends and family. As the Minister has pointed out, Nigeria has the capacity to deal with Boko Haram if it so chose. It is, after all, has the largest GDP on the continent, spends these huge amounts of money on arms and weaponry, and was very effective in relation to Ebola. So does the Minister agree with me that what people want to know is what is the British government doing to put the maximum political pressure on the Nigerian government so they're aware that people all over the world are watching them and want them to step up to this crisis?
I think we more than step up to the crisis. I've said that we have one of the biggest bilateral aid budgets to Nigeria in the world, which we can be proud of to all the diaspora here in the UK, 250 million approximately a year, and all the additional packages that I've just announced. The Honourable Lady just said one thing. She says with the wealth within Nigeria, they have the capacity to handle these things. I would disagree. I would say they should have the capacity to deal with these things. The reality is they don't. That's why a lot of UK support is in helping to build this capacity that they need with direct tactical training and advice to the Nigerian forces. So yes, I agree, they should have it. Currently, I do not believe they do.
Mr. Martin Horwood.
Does the Minister agree that the answers to violent extremism lie in inclusion and reconciliation, in development and in good governance, all of which DFID will continue to support in Nigeria even after the cameras have moved on, but also that effective evaluation of government-to-government aid must accompany that work?
The first thing to point out is no UK aid goes directly to the government of Nigeria. It goes to other organisations within Nigeria. And yes, we should continue to help build. I said you have to justify, I believe, overseas aid. It's a contentious issue, and what people don't want to see is overseas aid going to countries who squander it in some way. That's why we don't, on the whole, give overseas aid government to government, but why we also, when we look at countries like Nigeria, with its huge wealth, with its huge divisions of wealth, particularly between the North and the South, we do think there is a role in the British interests, apart from anything else, to help build capacity and strengthen institutions within that country so that it can handle these issues itself. That we will continue to do, whether the cameras are on us or whether the cameras are off us.
Mr. Keith Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the whole House appreciates what the government has done in order to support the government of Nigeria. However, specifically on counter-terrorism, we have the best counter-terrorism operation, in my view, in the world. Has he had a specific discussion with the Home Secretary about any counter-terrorism support that we can give the Nigerian authorities? They may be very rich, but they lack the kind of expertise that we have.
The best thing that we can do is, what we have done is provide satellite imagery and training, surveillance and intelligence assistance to the Nigerian authorities. We have, in a search earlier, deployed Sentinel and Tornado GR4 aircraft with surveillance capabilities. No, I have not had a discussion with the Home Secretary. These things have been handled to date by the Ministry of Defence, Department for International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Mr. Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with trying to gain intelligence is that the only way you're going to get really good intelligence is to put troops into the area where intelligence can be gathered. The Nigerian government already spends 20% of its gross national income on security. Would the Minister consider whether it would be possible for some kind of coalition under the United Nations, paid for, at least in part, by the Nigerian government, to be put on the ground so that effective troops could go into this area the size of Belgium, so that we get decent intelligence and give some kind of reassurance to the people on the ground there?
Mr. State.
No, Mr. Speaker, no British troops will be deployed in Nigeria in this role.
Thank you, Leah.
Mr. Speaker, I should declare that I chair the all-party group on Nigeria. While not wanting to diminish the evils of Boko Haram, we do know that the security forces and the Nigerian police can have themselves cause problems while tackling the actions of Boko Haram. I know that the Foreign Office has met with the Nigerian Metropolitan Police Nigerian Police Forum. There are nearly 900 Nigerian origin police officers in the Met, and I wondered if he could update the House on where those discussions are going and whether there is a role for the Metropolitan Police and other police in the UK to help embed human rights policing in Nigeria.
There are human rights issues not only in the police in Nigeria, there are human rights issues in the armed forces in Nigeria, and these are very serious concerns and have to be balanced against any assistance that we actually provide, and that applies to us and France and, of course, the United States. In response to her particular question about any assistance that the Metropolitan Police might be able to offer, I think that's a question best answered by the Home Office, and I shall make sure my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, answers that question fully.
Nicola Blackwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this appalling violence spreads, can the Minister outline specific measures the UK has taken to help Nigerian authorities' ability to specifically protect civilians in the more isolated and rural areas? And in particular, given the targeting of so many women and girls, what steps are being taken to share our specific technical expertise in preventing and prosecuting sexual violence in conflict?
Well, I won't rehearse again all the assistance we've given to Nigeria, if that's all right, particularly since June. The issue that my honourable friend alludes to at the end, the prevention of sexual violence in conflict, is extraordinarily difficult to have a conversation with at the moment about that. You can have it with the Nigerian armed forces and the military, yes you can, but actually when you are talking about girls being abducted in vast numbers, made to convert religion and then married off in great swathes of the country, I think it's a bit premature to try and start talking about the prevention of sexual violence. This is an endemic problem right across the struggle between the Nigerian authorities and Boko Haram.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a sobering thought that the deaths of so many, hundreds and thousands of Nigerians last week warranted so little attention in this country. And my honourable friend spoke of the need for solidarity across continents. Could I ask the Minister, in the wake of yesterday's moving show of solidarity across the Channel, in discussions with the French, which will undoubtedly follow, will he set out or see how UK and France can work together to give security assistance, specifically at the border between Nigeria and the Niger, the porous border which enables Boko Haram to melt back after their atrocious crimes?
Indeed, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. There have, of course, been a number of ministerial meetings around the world to look at the situation in Nigeria. The UK will be attending the next follow-up meeting on addressing the security situation in Nigeria on the 20th of January in Niamey, in the capital of Niger. Coordinating the regional approach to Boko Haram's violent campaign is, as she suggests, vital. The terrorists don't respect national borders, and recent attacks on Cameroon as well have been extremely bloody. But the House should be in no doubt, Mr. Speaker, this is going to be a long and a very difficult task, but we are committed totally to standing by Nigeria in its fight against terrorism.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, as the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North said, the Nigerian state showed a very strong response to Ebola, and yet the response to terrorism in the north has been extraordinarily weak, with soldiers reported not even to have bullets for their weapons. How does the Minister of State account for this enormous discrepancy in the competence?
I think we would have liked to see a more robust attitude from the army and the military to what is going on in the northern state, but it is an extraordinarily complicated question there. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually find out what is going on, and we read lots of stories about people changing sides and equipment being seized, but it is absolutely certain that the Nigerian army do need better training to combat what is an absolutely incredibly violent terrorist organisation such as Boko Haram, and they need more assistance and more training. But as I've just said, Mr. Speaker, this cannot be done overnight.
Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, I think the House owes a debt of thanks to the member for Brent Central for ensuring we got this question today. Millions turned out across Europe, particularly in France yesterday, because of the atrocious killings in Paris. Millions more need to turn out all over the world concerning the deaths of innocent people in Nigeria. Does he not think it's very important for all governments and all parliaments for that matter to give the message that a lost human life because of this kind of atrocity is equally awful if it's in France or Nigeria or anywhere else, and every human life is a human life that should not be taken?
Well, hear to that. In 2014, we estimate that at least 4,000 people were killed in Boko Haram attacks. The insurgency is growing. It's a growing humanitarian issue. The UN estimates that over 1.5 million people have been displaced, and at least 3 million have been affected by the insurgency. And the honourable gentleman will have noted the words recently of the Catholic Archbishop of Jos in Nigeria, who has claimed that the West is not doing enough to support Nigeria in tackling Boko Haram, and he unfavourably compared the international community's response to the Paris terrorist attacks. I actually think the United Kingdom is showing the way, both in terms of leadership and in terms of financial assistance and training, and perhaps other countries should look at themselves to see what more they can do as well to join in this attack on terrorists.
Mr. Stephen Mosley.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Nigerian Armed Forces have complained that one of the reasons why they can't defeat Boko Haram militarily is because money that's been destined for equipment has been siphoned off by senior officials. Going back to the question asked by the member for my honourable friend, the member for Brent Central, what specific action is my honourable friend taking to tackle corruption in Nigeria?
There are issues about equipment going, about money not reaching the right place. All these allegations, I believe, are founded on truth, unfortunately. But that's why we have training teams in Nigeria to try and, I say, build better institutional capacity building to build a better military, a more accountable military, a more transparent military, so that these things do not go on happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been reported that the French have an initiative where they're trying to create a multinational task force comprising of Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon and Chad, but so far none of these countries have been prepared to provide the troops required. Is the United Kingdom supporting the French government in this initiative? Because surely this must be the way forward.
Well, I think I said earlier that it should be a regional solution. I mean, some of these countries are on the borders of Nigeria and are actually affected already, be they Niger or Cameroon or other countries. It has to be ultimately a regional solution. But also, you cannot offer help if the country you are offering it to does not want it. And so we have to hear more from the government, from the Nigerian government, as to how the international community can assist, particularly locally, and hopefully from that can come a suggestion or a force such as the one the Right Honourable Lady suggests.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
No one can have a sensible discussion about Nigeria unless one looks at the exponential population growth of the country. In 1950, there were 33 million Nigerians. There are now 175 million, and the UN's central estimate for 2100 is for there to be 730 million Nigerians. 1 in 5 Africans is Nigerian, and half the population is under the age of 14. Against the background of this huge demographic instability, is the Minister satisfied that the Foreign Office understands the potential catastrophe for Africa of there being a successful Islamic insurgency in this country?
Absolutely. We are extremely concerned about this spreading. I've already said that. But let me look at the glass as being half full rather than half empty, as my honourable friend does. Nigeria is the richest economy in Africa. It has huge talent. You only have to look at the Nigerian diaspora who are here in this country to recognise that. So there are huge opportunities. It is rich in resources, but it does have bad problems, endemic problems, with a disparity of wealth which is far too great, with a geographical disparity of wealth from the north to south which is far too great. But I believe that if an incoming Nigerian government of whatever persuasion in February is determined to invite in the international community in a more open way to help rebuild a modern Nigeria, it can become a shining beacon on the African continent of what a country like that can achieve.
Mr. Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fear that for many people listening to this debate, including perhaps a million or more British citizens of Nigerian origin, will see the government minister's response as being not adequate. Inadequate because the frame of the problem that he has put around is smaller than they perceive it to be. Not adequate because the response where we are at the behest of the Nigerian government rather than actively pushing for change in the Nigerian government to take action is too weak. And thirdly, for the thousands of people who are running for their lives right now, he has not outlined one measure that will give them any hope for any change in the near future. With the greatest respect for those who took part, our response to Boko Haram needs more than a hashtag and a photo opportunity. It needs active response by this government that believes in the freedom of the individual wherever they are in the world. May I ask the Minister to reflect on that and perhaps come back to this House with a more substantive response to us?
I simply don't recognise any of that, and I certainly don't know when he talks about photo opportunities and Boko Haram. There certainly haven't been any that I'm aware of. Look, we have one of the biggest bilateral aid budgets, £250 million. We are doing a lot on education and safety in schools in Nigeria, but at the end of the day, Nigeria is a rich country and they need to be taught to do these things themselves. So I believe the UK is actually at the forefront of trying to assist Nigeria. You cannot impose assistance if that assistance is not asked for in another country. There's something called sovereignty, which may have escaped my honourable friend's notice. And the Nigerian government are, perhaps as I've said, too slow to ask the international community for help, but the United Kingdom should be proud of its record as being at the forefront of attempts to right some horrible wrongs that are going on in that country.
Order.